For 15 years, James Hetfield and Jason Newsted hadn't spoken. Not since Jason left Metallica in 2001, bitter about how he'd been treated, resentful of the years he'd spent feeling like the band's outsider. They'd been brothers once, but that relationship had died. Then, in 2023, James's phone rang. It was Jason. "I need to tell you something," Jason said. "I just sold a painting for $50 million, and I'm donating all of it to your charity, in Metallica's name." James was silent, trying to process what he was hearing. The man who had every reason to hate Metallica was giving away a fortune in their honor. "Why?" James finally asked. Jason's answer was simple. "Because you made me who I am, and I was angry for too long." That phone call led to the first real conversation they'd had in over a decade, and eventually to a reunion nobody thought would ever happen. To understand the weight of that phone call, you need to know the history between Jason Newsted and Metallica. Jason joined Metallica in 1986, weeks after Cliff Burton's tragic death. He was 23, replacing a legend in a band on the verge of global success. The pressure was immense. For 15 years, Jason was Metallica's bassist. He played on successful albums, toured worldwide, lived the dream. But inside the band, he often felt like an outsider. In interviews over the years, he's spoken about feeling undervalued, his musical ideas dismissed, a hierarchy that made him feel more employee than equal partner. There were specific incidents, resistance to his side project Echo Brain, musical ideas overruled, voice not carrying weight. Year after year, resentment built. In 2001, Jason left Metallica. Official statements were cordial, but beneath the surface was real bitterness. He'd given 15 years to a band that never fully accepted him as an equal. The years after his departure were difficult for Jason. He continued making music with various projects, but nothing achieved the success or recognition of Metallica. For a while, it seemed like his identity would always be Metallica's former bassist, defined by what he left rather than what he was doing now. During this time, Jason discovered a new creative outlet, visual art. He'd always been interested in painting and sculpture, but as a side interest. After leaving Metallica, with more time and mental space, he began taking it seriously. He studied techniques, experimented with different mediums, and found that visual art allowed him to express things that music never had. Initially, his art was private, a way to process his feelings about his years in Metallica, about fame, about identity. But gradually, he began showing his work. Small galleries at first, then larger exhibitions. Critics started taking notice. Jason Newsted, the artist, was creating work that stood on its own merit, completely separate from his musical legacy. His paintings often explored themes of sound made visual, abstract representations of music, color schemes inspired by metal album aesthetics, textured canvases that seemed to vibrate with energy. He also created pieces about isolation, about being part of something while feeling outside of it, about the weight of living in someone else's shadow. Over 20 years, Jason built a genuine reputation in the art world. He wasn't taken seriously because he'd been in Metallica. He was taken seriously because his work was good. That distinction mattered deeply to him. This was his achievement, built from nothing, proving he had value beyond his musical past. In 2022, Jason began work on what would become his masterpiece. It was a massive canvas, 10 feet tall, 15 feet wide, that took him 8 months to complete. He called it Master of Puppets, a direct reference to Metallica's album that had defined so much of his early experience with the band. In September 2019, Metallica had a concert scheduled in Sacramento, California. The morning of the concert, James woke up early. He'd been thinking about his mother more than usual lately. The anniversary of her death was approaching, and something in him decided that before he performed that night, he needed to visit her grave. Cynthia Hetfield is buried in Colma, California, a town just south of San Francisco that's famous for being the city of the dead. There are more people buried in Colma than living in it, over 1.5 million graves in a town with a population of around 1,500. It's where many San Francisco families have buried their dead for over a century. James drove the 2 hours from wherever Metallica was staying to Colma. He arrived at the cemetery early in the morning, before most visitors would be there. He parked, walked through the rows of headstones, and found his mother's grave. He hadn't visited in years, maybe decades. He brought an acoustic guitar with him. Robert Chen was working that morning. He noticed a man arrive, alone, carrying a guitar case. Robert recognized him, James Hetfield, one of the most famous musicians in the world. But Robert stayed at a respectful distance. Whatever this man was doing, it was clearly private. James sat down beside his mother's headstone. He took out the acoustic guitar and started playing. Robert, working nearby, couldn't help but hear. The acoustic guitar in the quiet morning carried clearly. He recognized the melody, one of Metallica's songs, played much softer than the version he'd heard on the radio. But it wasn't just the music. James was talking. Robert couldn't hear every word, but he could hear enough. James was talking to his mother. "Mom, I wrote this song when you died. It's called Fade to Black. I was so angry. I blamed you for leaving us. I blamed your faith. I blamed you for choosing God over your children." Robert continued his work, trying not to intrude but unable to avoid overhearing. This was clearly something deeply personal, and he felt uncomfortable even being a distant witness to it. But he also couldn't leave. He had work to do in that section. "I've been angry for 40 years. Every time I play this song, I feel that anger. Every time I sing these words, I'm 16 again, watching you die, feeling abandoned." James played through the song quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Then he stopped and sat in silence for a moment. "But I understand now," he said finally. "You were sick. You were scared. You did what you believed was right. You weren't choosing faith over us. You were trying to have faith in the face of something terrifying. You weren't abandoning us. You were dying, and that wasn't your choice, even if the way you faced it was." Robert Chen, maintaining his respectful distance, felt his own throat tighten. He was witnessing something sacred, a son forgiving his mother 40 years after her death. "I'm sorry I was angry at you. I'm sorry I blamed you. I'm sorry I let that anger define so much of my life. You did the best you could with what you believed. And I love you. I should have said that more when you were alive. I love you, Mom." James stayed at the grave for 3 hours, sometimes playing guitar softly, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in silence. Robert Chen worked in other sections of the cemetery, checking back occasionally, but always maintaining that respectful distance. Eventually, James stood up, put his guitar back in its case, and walked back to his car. He never knew that anyone had heard him. He never knew there was a witness to his moment of forgiveness. That evening, Metallica performed in Sacramento in front of 50,000 people. The show started normally. The energy was high, the crowd was enthusiastic, the band was tight. They played through their set, hitting all the familiar songs that fans had come to hear. Then they started playing Fade to Black. James had played this song thousands of times over the decades. It was one of Metallica's most requested tracks. He knew every word, every note, every moment. But that night, something was different. As he sang, he thought about that morning, about sitting at his mother's grave, about the forgiveness he'd finally been able to express, about the weight of 40 years of anger that he'd let go of. Halfway through the song, James's voice started to crack. He tried to keep singing, but tears were forming in his eyes. The words of the song, Words about death, about loss, about fading away, suddenly meant something different. They weren't just about anger anymore. They were about grief, about love, about finally letting go. James stopped singing. He couldn't continue. Tears were streaming down his face. He lowered the microphone, turned away from the crowd, trying to compose himself, but the emotion was too strong. 40 years of holding on to pain, released in one overwhelming moment. The crowd went silent. 50,000 people watching in confusion as their frontman broke down on stage. The band kept playing, unsure what else to do, but James couldn't join back in. He was crying too hard to sing, too overwhelmed to perform. Security, concerned that something was medically wrong, approached James. He waved them off at first, but the tears wouldn't stop. Eventually, he allowed them to escort him off stage. The music stopped. The crowd murmured in confusion and concern. Backstage, James tried to explain to his bandmates what was happening, but words were difficult. All he could say was that he needed a moment, that he was okay, that it was personal. His bandmates, who'd known him for decades, recognized grief when they saw it. They gave him space. 20 minutes later, James returned to the stage. His eyes were still red, his voice still shaky, but he was composed enough to continue. He didn't explain what had happened. He just said, "Thank you for your patience. Let's finish this." And they did. The band completed the show, and James powered through the remaining songs. After the concert, fans and media speculated wildly about what had caused the breakdown. Was it health-related? Had James relapsed into addiction? Was there a family emergency? Metallica's management released a brief statement. James experienced a personal moment during the performance. He is fine. The tour will continue as scheduled. But no real explanation was ever given. James didn't talk about it in interviews. The band didn't elaborate. For 5 years, the incident remained one of rock music's mysteries, a moment witnessed by 50,000 people, but understood by none of them. Robert Chen, the cemetery groundskeeper, saw news coverage of the incident online the next day. He recognized James Hetfield's name immediately, realized it was the same man he'd seen that morning at the cemetery. Video clips of the breakdown circulated on social media, James's face contorted with emotion, tears streaming, being led off stage by concerned security personnel. Robert understood immediately what had happened. The breakdown wasn't a crisis, not a health emergency, not a relapse, not a family tragedy unfolding in real time. It was catharsis. It was the release of 40 years of grief that had finally found forgiveness. What James had done at his mother's grave that morning had been so profound, so emotionally transformative, that when he performed the very song he'd played for her just hours earlier, the dam had broken completely. Robert kept the secret. It wasn't his story to tell. What he'd witnessed that morning was private, sacred, a man's conversation with his dead mother, a moment of forgiveness that had taken 4 decades to arrive. James Hetfield didn't know he'd been overheard, and Robert felt it would be a violation to reveal it. The man deserved his privacy, even if 50,000 people had witnessed the public result of that private moment. But in 2024, 5 years after the incident, Robert Chen retired from his position at the cemetery after 30 years of service. A local newspaper in Colma wanted to do a feature story about his decades of work in the City of the Dead, about his experiences, about the famous and not famous people whose final resting places he'd tended over the years. During the interview, the reporter asked if Robert had ever encountered anyone famous visiting the cemetery. Robert mentioned several names, then paused. He mentioned James Hetfield's visit in 2019. The reporter, a Metallica fan, sat up straighter. Wait, 2019? Was that in September? Robert confirmed it was. The reporter remembered the Sacramento concert, the mysterious breakdown that had never been explained. And Robert, deciding that 5 years was long enough to keep the secret, that perhaps the story deserved to be told, shared what he'd witnessed that morning. "I know why he broke down that night," Robert said. "He doesn't know that I know, but I was there that morning. I heard him forgiving his mother after 40 years of being angry at her for dying. He sat at her grave for 3 hours. He played guitar for her. He apologized for being angry. He told her he understood. And then, that night when he played the song he'd written about her death in front of 50,000 people, all of that emotion came flooding out." The interview spread online. Fans who'd been at that concert in 2019 finally understood what they'd witnessed. The moment stopped being mysterious and became meaningful. James Hetfield, who'd spent 40 years channeling rage and pain into his music, had finally found forgiveness. And that forgiveness had been so powerful, so overwhelming, that it had broken through in front of 50,000 witnesses. James has never publicly confirmed or denied Robert Chan's account. He's maintained his privacy around the incident. But fans who understand the story now listen to Fade to Black differently. It's not just a song about despair anymore. It's a song about a 16-year-old boy losing his mother, about 40 years of grief, and about a 56-year-old man finally learning to forgive. This story resonates because it touches something universal. How many of us carry anger toward people who've hurt us, even or especially people who've died? How many of us hold on to pain because letting go feels like betraying our younger selves who were legitimately hurt? How many of us wait decades before we're ready to forgive? James Hetfield wrote some of rock music's most aggressive, angry songs. But beneath that anger was grief, and beneath that grief was love, and it took 40 years before he could access that love again without the anger and grief blocking it. The cemetery groundskeeper's revelation transforms what 50,000 people saw that night. It wasn't weakness they witnessed, it was strength, the strength required to let go of 40 years of justified anger. It wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. And it reminds us that even rock stars, even people who seem larger than life, are just human beings carrying the same griefs and wounds the rest of us carry. The only difference is sometimes their healing happens in front of 50,000 witnesses instead of in the privacy of their own lives.